The 5 horsemen had been following him since sundown, their spurs jingling like death bells against the stirrups as they maintained their distance through the dusty streets of Perdition Creek. Ezekiel Thorne pulled his worn hat lower over his gray eyes and quickened his pace, his weathered boots clicking against the wooden sidewalk planks. The autumn wind carried the scent of coming rain and the acrid smell of coal smoke from the locomotive that had departed an hour ago. Behind him, Crane Murdoch sat tall in his saddle, a cruel smile spreading across his scarred face as he watched the old man hurry toward what appeared to be safety. At 28 years old, Crane had built his reputation on fear and violence, leaving a trail of bodies from Kansas to California. His black leather coat hung open to display the twin Colts at his hips, their handles worn smooth from constant use. The 4 men riding with him were cut from the same bloody cloth. Torres, thin as a whip with nervous eyes that darted constantly. Briggs, broad-shouldered and mean, with knuckles that bore the scars of too many saloon fights. The Morrison twins, Jack and Wade, barely 20 but already wanted in 3 territories for robbery and murder. They had been watching Ezekiel for 2 days, ever since the bank teller's daughter had pointed him out as someone who might know about the vault's new combination. Little Sarah McNeil, barely 16 with golden hair and frightened blue eyes, had been walking home from her job at the cattleman's bank when Crane had cornered her near the livery stable. The poor girl had stammered that she did not know anything about the vault, but mentioned seeing an old man lingering near the bank each morning, sometimes talking with her father about security matters. Now that same old man was leading them straight into the perfect trap. The alley behind the cattleman's bank was a dead end, hemmed in by brick walls on 3 sides with only one way out. Ezekiel glanced over his shoulder once, his pale eyes meeting Crane's for just a moment before he ducked into the narrow passage between the bank and the general store. Crane spurred his horse forward, motioning for his men to spread out. The hoofbeats echoed off the brick walls as they entered the alley, trapping their prey in what would soon become his tomb. The space was barely wide enough for 2 horses to stand side by side, with wooden crates and barrels scattered along the walls. A single oil lamp hung from a post near the bank's rear entrance, casting dancing shadows across the weathered brick. But before you see how this tale of justice unfolds, if you are enjoying this story of the Old West, hit that like button and comment what country you are listening from. I love seeing how these stories of courage and consequence travel across the world. Ezekiel stood with his back to them, his shoulders hunched as if in defeat. His gray hair peeked out from beneath his battered hat, and his coat hung loose on his thin frame. When he turned around, his hands were visibly shaking as he raised them in surrender. The man appeared to be past 70, with deep lines carved into his face by decades of sun and hardship. Wire-rimmed spectacles sat perched on his nose, and his pale blue eyes held what looked like genuine terror. Perfect, Crane thought as he dismounted. This would be easier than taking candy from a child. You boys picked the wrong old fool to follow, Crane called out, his voice echoing off the brick walls. Torres and Briggs climbed down from their horses while the Morrison twins remained mounted, blocking the only exit. The gang leader pulled one of his Colts and let it hang loose at his side, the metal gleaming in the lamplight. Sarah McNeil had been hiding behind a stack of flour barrels near the general store's loading dock, trying to make her way home without being seen. When she spotted the 5 horsemen cornering the old man, every instinct told her to run. Instead, she crouched lower behind the barrels, her heart hammering as she watched the scene unfold. She had seen Crane and his men around town for the past week, and everyone knew they were trouble. Her father had warned her to stay away from them, but now they had this poor old gentleman trapped like a rat. "Please," Ezekiel said, his voice quavering as he gestured toward the girl's hiding place. "Let the child go. She has nothing to do with this." His hands continued to shake as he spoke, and sweat glistened on his forehead despite the cool evening air. Crane's laugh was harsh and ugly. "Oh, but she does, old man. Little Sarah there has been telling us about the bank vault, haven't you, girl?" He swung his gun toward the barrels where she was hiding. "Come on out where we can see you proper." Sarah emerged slowly, her face pale with terror. She wore a simple blue dress and white apron, her golden hair tied back with a ribbon that had come loose during her attempt to hide. "Please, mister," she whispered. "I told you already, I do not know anything about Papa's work." Torres shifted uncomfortably on his feet, glancing between Crane and the girl. Boss, maybe we should just take what we came for and get out of town. This feels wrong, cornering an old man and a child. Shut your mouth, Torres, Crane snapped. We do this my way. He turned his attention back to Ezekiel, studying the old man's terrified expression with satisfaction. You see, Grandpa, your little friend here is going to tell us everything we need to know about that bank vault. And you are going to help convince her. Ezekiel took a step forward, his hands still raised but no longer shaking quite as much. That would not be necessary, son. I believe there has been some misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding is you thinking you had any choice in the matter, Crane replied. He raised his pistol until it pointed directly at Ezekiel's chest. Now, both of you are going to answer my questions, or this alley is going to get a lot bloodier. Briggs cracked his knuckles and grinned, showing teeth stained brown from tobacco. I say we start with the girl, boss. Old men break easier when they watch someone else suffer first. That would be unwise, Ezekiel said quietly, his voice carrying a strange new quality that made Torres take an involuntary step backward. Crane's finger tightened on the trigger. And why is that, you ancient relic? For the first time since entering the alley, Ezekiel Thorne smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. Because, he said, his pale eyes beginning to reflect the lamplight like chips of winter ice, I chose this alley for a reason. Crane's face twisted with rage at the old man's cryptic words. He swung his gun hand in a vicious arc, the barrel catching Sarah McNeil across her left cheek with a sharp crack that echoed off the brick walls. The girl cried out and stumbled backward, her hand flying to her face as blood trickled from a cut where the metal had split her skin. That was not necessary, son, Ezekiel said quietly, his voice carrying a tone that made the temperature in the alley seem to drop several degrees. Crane wheeled on him, spittle flying from his lips. Do not call me son, you decrepit old fool. I am Crane Murdoch, and men from here to El Paso cross the street when they see me coming. He gestured wildly with his pistol. You are nothing but a broken-down relic who should have died years ago. The gang leader's eyes burned with the kind of madness that came from too many years of taking what he wanted without consequence. His black hair hung in greasy strands around his scarred face, and his breath reeked of whiskey and violence. When he smiled, it revealed teeth filed to points, a barbaric practice he had adopted to make himself appear more fearsome. Briggs laughed, a harsh sound like rocks grinding together. Look at him shake, boss. Probably wet himself when he heard your name. The big man stepped closer to Ezekiel, his massive frame casting a shadow across the old man's face. What do you say, Grandpa? Ready to tell us what we want to know? Or do we start cutting pieces off the girl? Torres remained near the horses, his dark eyes darting between his companions and their prisoners. Something about this situation felt wrong to him, though he could not quite identify what was bothering him. Perhaps it was the way the old man stood, or maybe it was how his initial terror seemed to be slowly draining away, replaced by something else entirely. Sarah pressed herself against the brick wall, tears streaming down her face as she clutched her injured cheek. Please, she whispered. I truly do not know anything about the vault combination. Papa never tells me about his work at the bank. Maybe we should try a different approach, Jack Morrison suggested, dismounting from his horse. His twin brother Wade remained in the saddle, keeping watch on the alley entrance. Jack was the younger of the two by mere minutes, but he had always been the more creative when it came to inflicting pain. Let me have a few minutes alone with her, boss. I bet I can loosen her tongue real quick. Ezekiel took a step forward, and Torres noticed something that made his stomach tighten with unease. Despite his apparent age and frailty, the old man moved with a fluid grace that spoke of years of practice. His worn boots, which Torres now saw were made of fine leather and built for someone who spent serious time on his feet, made no sound against the dirt floor of the alley. I would advise against that course of action, Ezekiel said, and this time his voice carried the unmistakable weight of authority. The wire-rimmed spectacles caught the lamplight, but behind them, his pale eyes had begun to change. What had appeared to be roomy blue was slowly hardening into something that reminded Torres of winter ice on a deep lake. Crane backhanded Ezekiel across the face, the sound sharp and cruel in the confined space. Shut your mouth, ancient. Nobody asked for your advice. The old man's head snapped to the side, but he did not cry out. Instead, He slowly turned back to face Crane, and when he did, Torres felt his blood turn cold. There was no fear left in those pale eyes. None at all. "You have made your second mistake tonight," Ezekiel said quietly, reaching up to adjust his spectacles with steady fingers. His hands were no longer shaking. Briggs grabbed a handful of the old man's gray hair and yanked his head back. "And what was the first mistake, you old buzzard?" "Following me in the first place," Ezekiel replied, his voice calm as a mountain lake. Torres found himself studying the old man more carefully now, and what he saw made his mouth go dry. The gun belt around Ezekiel's waist was not the cheap leather rig of a shopkeeper or farmer. It was tooled cowhide, well-oiled and cared for, with a holster that showed the kind of wear that came from thousands of draws. The brass buckle bore an inscription that Torres could not quite make out in the lamplight, but it had the look of something official. "Boss," Torres called out, his voice tight with growing alarm. "Maybe we should just take what we came for and ride out. This does not feel right." Crane spun toward him, fury blazing in his eyes. "Are you questioning my judgment, Torres? Because if you are, you can ride out right now and never come back." "It is just that something about this old man," Torres began, but Crane cut him off with a sharp gesture. "This old man is going to die tonight, along with the girl if they do not start talking." Crane raised his pistol and pointed it at Ezekiel's forehead. "Last chance, Grandpa. Tell us what we want to know about that vault." Ezekiel looked at the gun barrel for a long moment, then slowly raised his eyes to meet Crane's gaze. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that everyone in the alley had to strain to hear it. "I retired from my profession 10 years ago, hoping to find some peace in my remaining years. But watching you strike that innocent child has reminded me that some men understand only one language." "What language is that?" Crane snarled. "Violence," Ezekiel replied, and suddenly his posture was no longer that of a frail old man. His shoulders straightened, his spine became rigid, and when he looked at Crane, it was with the cold assessment of a professional predator evaluating prey. The transformation was so complete and so sudden that even Crane took an involuntary step backward. Wade Morrison shifted nervously in his saddle, his hand drifting toward the rifle in his scabbard. Jack Morrison, who had been reaching for Sarah again, froze with his arm extended. "You want to see how tough you are, old-timer?" Crane raised his pistol and fired a shot that took Ezekiel's hat clean off his head. The worn felt tumbled to the ground, revealing hair that was indeed gray, but was thick and well-maintained rather than the thin wisps of true old age. Ezekiel did not flinch. He did not duck. He did not even blink. Instead, he slowly bent down and picked up his hat, brushing the dust from it with careful movements before placing it back on his head. When he straightened, his pale eyes had gone completely cold, like chips of winter ice that could cut a man just by looking. Torres felt his knees go weak. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of a federal marshal who had tracked him across 2 territories 15 years ago. It was the look of a man who had killed before and would kill again without losing a moment's sleep. "Boss," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think we need to leave. Right now." But Crane was too drunk on his own power and too stupid to recognize the danger standing right in front of him. He laughed, the sound echoing off the brick walls like the cackle of a madman. "Did you see that, boys?" The old goat did not even flinch. "Maybe he is tougher than he looks." Ezekiel simply stood there, studying each of the 5 men with the methodical patience of someone taking inventory. His pale eyes lingered on each face just long enough to memorize it, and Torres had the sickening feeling that the old man was counting them the way a butcher might count cattle before the slaughter. "That was your third mistake," Ezekiel said quietly. "And in my experience, 3 mistakes are usually enough to get a man killed." Ezekiel reached up with deliberate slowness and began unbuttoning his worn brown coat. The fabric was faded and patched in places, the kind of garment a man might wear if he wanted to blend in among farmers and shopkeepers. But as he shrugged it off his shoulders and let it fall to the ground, something metallic caught the lamplight pinned to his vest. A star. 6 points, tarnished with age but unmistakably real. The kind of badge that carried the full weight of federal authority behind it. Torres felt his heart stop beating for a full second. He had seen that particular star before, burned into his memory from wanted posters and whispered stories around outlaw campfires. The distinctive design with its eagle wings spread across the top point was unique to one organization. United States Marshals Service. But it was not just any marshal's badge. This one bore scratches and dents that told stories of violence survived and justice delivered. The brass was darkened with age and wear, and there were small notches filed along one edge that Torres suddenly realized might represent something far more sinister than mere decoration. "Boss," Torres whispered, his voice cracking like that of a man facing his own execution. His face had gone white as fresh snow, and his hands began trembling so violently that he nearly dropped his pistol. "Boss, that is Ezekiel Thorne." Crane barely glanced at the badge, his attention focused on maintaining his grip on power through intimidation and violence. "Never heard of him," he snarled. "Just another broken-down lawman who could not hack it anymore." "You have heard of him," Torres insisted, backing toward his horse with slow, careful steps. "You just never knew his name." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might summon death itself. "They called him the Grayback Marshal, the one who cleaned out the Dalton gang, single-handed down in Devil's Canyon." Sarah McNeil pressed herself harder against the brick wall, her injured cheek forgotten as she watched the drama unfold. Even she had heard stories of the legendary marshal who had brought order to the wildest territories when the regular law could not handle the job. Her father had told her tales of the man who could track outlaws across impossible terrain and always brought them back either in chains or draped across their saddles. Briggs looked confused, his simple mind struggling to process the shift in Torres's demeanor. "What are you talking about?" "It is just some old badge he probably bought off a dead lawman." But Jack Morrison had gone pale as well, his hand moving away from Sarah, as if she had suddenly become too dangerous to touch. Wade Morrison was already backing his horse toward the alley entrance, his survival instincts overriding his loyalty to the gang. Ezekiel stood perfectly still in the center of the alley, the lamplight playing across the weathered lines of his face. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind of tone that had made hardened killers surrender without firing a shot. 43 men I put down in 20 years wearing this badge," he said quietly, his pale eyes reflecting the light like chips of ice. 43 men who thought they could take what they wanted from innocent people without consequence. His voice grew softer, more conversational, but somehow that made it infinitely more terrifying. There was Bill Hendricks, who liked to torture homesteaders before he killed them. Found him hiding in a cave near Tombstone. He chose to draw on me rather than surrender. Torres was now mounting his horse with shaking hands, his loyalty to Crane evaporating like morning mist. "Boss, we need to ride. Now." Then there was Marcus Delacroix, who specialized in robbing stagecoaches carrying women and children. Ezekiel continued as if Torres had not spoken. "He had killed 17 people by the time I caught up with him outside Santa Fe. He begged for mercy at the end." Crane's face was flushed red with anger and embarrassment, but underneath Torres could see the first flicker of genuine fear. "You are lying, old man. Trying to scare us with tall tales." Ezekiel reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small leather journal, its pages yellow with age. "Would you like me to read you the names?" "All 43 of them, along with the dates and locations where justice was served?" He opened the book, and Torres caught a glimpse of neat handwriting covering every page. "Or perhaps you would prefer to hear about the Dalton gang specifically." The old marshal's eyes grew distant, as if he were seeing events that had happened years before. August 15th, 1887. Devil's Canyon, Arizona Territory. Cole Dalton had been terrorizing settlers for 6 months, burning farms and killing anyone who stood in his way. He rode with 8 men, all of them wanted for murder. Sarah found herself holding her breath as Ezekiel spoke. His voice had taken on the cadence of someone reciting from memory, each detail burned into his consciousness by blood and gunpowder. They had cornered a family of homesteaders in their own cabin, planning to do terrible things before they killed them. Ezekiel's voice remained calm, but his eyes had gone completely cold. "I gave them one chance to surrender." Cole Dalton laughed and told me what he was going to do to the farmer's wife and daughter. "What happened then?" Sarah whispered, unable to stop herself. Ezekiel looked at her for a moment, and she saw something that might have been regret flicker across his features. "I killed all 9 of them in less than 2 minutes. Some with my guns, some with my knife, and Cole Dalton with my bare hands." Torres was now fully mounted, his horse dancing nervously beneath him. "Boss, please. We have to go." But Crane's pride would not let him retreat, even as his survival instincts screamed at him to run. "So what?" he demanded, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "That was 20 years ago. You are old and slow now." Ezekiel carefully returned the journal to his pocket and adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles. His movements were precise and economical, like those of a man who had learned to waste no motion when death was on the line. "I also trained Wyatt Earp when he was just a boy deputy in Dodge City," he said conversationally. "Taught him everything he knew about reading men's intentions and staying alive in gunfights." People remember Wyatt, but they forget who taught him to shoot. The old marshal's stance began to shift, his body language transforming from that of a frail old man to something far more dangerous. His feet spread to shoulder width, his weight balanced perfectly on the balls of his feet. His right hand hung loose at his side, fingers slightly curved. "I spent 3 years tracking the Apache renegade called Red Wolf through mountains where no white man was supposed to be able to survive. When I finally cornered him, he told me I fought like one of his own people. Then he tried to kill me with a tomahawk." And Briggs asked despite himself. "I used his own weapon to scalp him," Ezekiel replied matter-of-factly. "Sent the scalp to the territorial governor as proof of completion." Wade Morrison had reached the alley entrance and was clearly preparing to bolt. His brother Jack was slowly backing away from Sarah, his face pale with terror. "I retired 10 years ago, hoping to find some peace in my remaining years," Ezekiel continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I bought a small cabin outside town, tended a garden, read books. I thought my killing days were over." His pale eyes swept across each member of the gang, cataloging their positions and weapons with professional efficiency. "But some things a man cannot ignore, and hurting innocent children is one of them." The transformation was now complete. Where moments before had stood a seemingly frail old man, now there was something else entirely. A predator. A killer who had survived 20 years in the most dangerous profession imaginable and lived to tell about it. Torres wheeled his horse around and spurred it toward the alley entrance. "I am done, boss. This is suicide." Crane watched his most reliable man flee and felt his authority crumbling around him. His face twisted with rage and desperation as he realized he was trapped by his own pride and reputation. "You are all cowards," he screamed at his remaining men. "He is just one old man." Ezekiel Thorne smiled then, and it was the most terrifying expression Sarah McNeil had ever seen. Cold as winter death and sharp as a razor blade. "Yes," he said quietly, his right hand drifting almost imperceptibly closer to his gun. "But I am very good at what I do." Ezekiel gestured casually toward the brick walls surrounding them, his movement as relaxed as a professor lecturing to students. "You asked why I chose this alley," he said, his voice carrying the tone of a man explaining something obvious to children. "Allow me to demonstrate." He pointed to the narrow passage they had entered through. "One way in, which means one way out." But notice the stack of wooden crates beside the entrance. Anyone trying to leave quickly would have to navigate around them, slowing their escape by precious seconds. Crane's eyes darted to the crates, and for the first time he seemed to realize that what he had thought was random debris might have been deliberately positioned. "The water barrel behind me," Ezekiel continued, indicating the large steel container that sat against the bank's rear wall, "is positioned to provide perfect cover from gunfire while still allowing me clear lines of sight to every corner of this space. The metal is thick enough to stop any bullet you boys might fire." Briggs looked confused, his simple mind struggling to process the implications. "What are you talking about, old man?" "I am talking about preparation," Ezekiel replied calmly. "I spotted you following me 3 blocks ago. When I realized you intended to corner me somewhere, I chose the battlefield that would give me the greatest advantage." Sarah McNeil watched in fascination as the old marshal transformed the space around them into a tactical lecture. His pale eyes moved constantly, cataloging angles and distances with the precision of a military engineer. "The lamppost provides illumination that favors someone standing in my position while casting shadows that will conceal my exact location from shooters positioned near the entrance. The brick walls create an echo effect that will make it difficult for you to determine the precise source of gunfire." Jack Morrison had backed himself nearly to the wall, his hand hovering over his pistol but seemingly afraid to draw it. His brother Wade remained mounted near the entrance, clearly ready to flee at the first sign of serious trouble. But perhaps most importantly, Ezekiel continued, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone. This alley connects to the network of passages that run behind the commercial buildings on Main Street, which means that while you see a dead end, I see multiple escape routes that only a man who has studied this town would know about. Crane's face was flushed red with anger and growing fear. You talk too much, old man. Let us see how well your planning works against Hot Lead. The gang leader drew his pistol in a smooth motion, but before he could bring it to bear, Ezekiel had moved. Not with the speed of youth, but with the fluid efficiency of someone who had performed the same action thousands of times. His own weapon appeared in his hand as if by magic, the worn grip fitting his fingers like an extension of his own body. The gunshot echoed through the alley like thunder, but it was not Crane who had fired. Crane looked down at his hand in shock. His pistol was gone, blown clean from his fingers by a bullet that had struck the weapon's cylinder with surgical precision. His hand was uninjured except for the sting of hot metal fragments, but his gun lay in pieces on the ground. That was just to show you what 40 years of practice looks like, Ezekiel said calmly, his own weapon already back in its holster. The movement had been so quick that Sarah had barely seen it happen. Briggs cursed and went for his gun, but Ezekiel's second shot took the weapon from his hand before he could clear leather. The big man yelped in pain as metal splinters drew blood from his palm. Jack Morrison tried to draw and found himself staring down the barrel of Ezekiel's pistol before his own weapon had cleared its holster. The young outlaw froze, his face white with terror. 3 shots, 3 disarmed men, Ezekiel observed with professional detachment. And I have 3 bullets left in this cylinder. Mathematics suggests you boys might want to reconsider your current course of action. Wade Morrison spurred his horse toward the alley entrance, abandoning his brother without a second thought. But as he reached the stacked crates, Ezekiel's 4th shot rang out. The bullet struck the top crate with perfect precision, sending it toppling directly into the path of the fleeing horse. The animal reared in terror, throwing Wade from the saddle. He landed hard against the brick wall and lay still, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. His horse bolted through the gap between buildings, disappearing into the night. Wade Morrison, Ezekiel said conversationally, as if he were reading from a catalog. 22 years old, wanted in Colorado for armed robbery. Favors a cavalry saber in addition to firearms, which suggests military experience. Probably deserted from the army. He swung his gun toward Jack Morrison, who was still frozen with his weapon half drawn. Jack Morrison, twin brother, also 22. Prefers knives to guns, especially when dealing with female victims. Has a distinctive scar on his left wrist from a fight with a saloon girl who fought back. How do you know all that? Jack whispered, his voice cracking with fear. Because I make it my business to know every dangerous man who rides through my territory, Ezekiel replied. Even in retirement, I keep informed about who needs killing. The old marshal's gaze shifted to Briggs, who was clutching his bleeding hand and backing toward the wall. Samuel Briggs, age 31, originally from Missouri. Strangled 3 prostitutes in Kansas City before fleeing west. Has a tendency to panic under pressure and make poor tactical decisions. As if to prove the assessment correct, Briggs suddenly lunged forward, trying to tackle the old marshal with his massive bulk. Ezekiel sidestepped the charge with minimal effort, bringing the butt of his pistol down on the back of Briggs's skull with precisely enough force to drop him unconscious without killing him. And finally, Crane Murdoch, Ezekiel said, turning his attention to the gang leader who stood empty-handed in the center of the alley. 28 years old, real name probably Carter Murphy based on the distinctive scar above your left eye from a childhood accident with farm equipment. Crane's mouth fell open. How could you possibly know that? Because 15 years ago, you robbed a stage near Phoenix and killed the driver for sport. One of the passengers was a federal judge who gave me a very detailed description of your face and mannerisms. I have been looking forward to meeting you ever since. The old marshal began walking slowly toward Crane, his boots clicking against the hard-packed earth. You see, Carter, men like you always make the same mistake. You think that violence is about anger and brutality. But professional violence, the kind that keeps you alive in this business, is about precision and planning. Sarah watched in fascination as Ezekiel demonstrated his point. Every movement was economical and purposeful. His eyes never stopped moving, constantly assessing threats and opportunities. Even his breathing was controlled, steady and deep like that of a man completely at peace with the possibility of death. You came into my town thinking you were predators, Ezekiel continued, now standing less than 10 feet from the unarmed gang leader. But you were wrong. You are prey, and you have been from the moment you decided to hurt innocent people in my territory. Crane's hand moved toward a hidden knife in his boot, but Ezekiel was ready for him. The fifth shot from the marshal's pistol shattered the blade before Crane could draw it, sending metal fragments spinning through the air. That makes 5, Ezekiel observed, ejecting the spent shells from his cylinder and beginning to reload with movements so practiced they seemed automatic. His fingers moved with mechanical precision, sliding fresh cartridges into each chamber without ever taking his eyes off his opponents. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the alley, mixing with the scent of fierce sweat and blood. Jack Morrison had finally drawn his pistol but seemed afraid to point it at the old marshal. Wade Morrison was stirring slightly, but appeared to be more unconscious than not. Briggs lay motionless on the ground. Now, Crane, or Carter, or whatever you want to be called in your final moments, Ezekiel said as he snapped the cylinder closed with a metallic click that seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. We come to the part of the evening where you face the consequences of your choices. The old marshal's pale eyes had gone completely cold, like winter ice over deep water. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. You have one chance to live through this night. Draw your backup weapon, because I know you carry at least 2 more, and face me like a man. Or spend your last moments on your knees begging for mercy you will not receive. Crane looked around desperately, but there was nowhere to run and no one left to help him. Torres was long gone, Wade was unconscious, Briggs was out cold, and Jack was too terrified to move. The gang leader reached slowly behind his back and drew a second pistol, this one smaller than his primary weapon, but no less deadly. I should have killed you the moment we rode into this alley, he said through gritted teeth. Ezekiel Thorne smiled, and it was the expression of a man who had been waiting 20 years for this exact moment. Yes, he said quietly. You should have. The alley fell silent except for the sound of 2 men breathing and the distant whistle of wind through the gaps between buildings. Ezekiel stood perfectly still, his freshly loaded pistol hanging loose at his side, while Crane gripped his backup weapon with white knuckles. The lamplight flickered between them, casting dancing shadows on the brick walls. You have one last chance to walk away from this, Ezekiel said quietly, his voice carrying across the space between them like the whisper of death itself. Drop your gun, mount whatever horse you can find, and ride out of my territory. Never come back. Crane's face twisted with rage and humiliation. The gang leader had built his entire reputation on never backing down, never showing weakness, never letting anyone get the better of him. To surrender now, in front of witnesses, would destroy everything he had spent years creating. I am Crane Murdoch, he snarled, raising his pistol until it pointed directly at the old marshal's chest. Men fear me from Kansas to California. I will not be beaten by some washed-up old lawman who should have died years ago. Ezekiel nodded slowly, as if he had expected exactly that response. Then you have chosen death, he said with the matter-of-fact tone of a man stating an obvious fact. So be it. The 2 men stood facing each other across 15 feet of packed earth, the classic distance for a formal gunfight. Sarah McNeil pressed herself harder against the brick wall, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain both men could hear it. Jack Morrison had backed himself into a corner near the unconscious Briggs, his own weapon forgotten in his trembling hand. Crane's eyes darted back and forth, looking for some advantage, some angle that might give him the upper hand. But Ezekiel simply waited with the infinite patience of a man who had stood in this exact position dozens of times before. His pale eyes never left Crane's face, reading every micro-expression, every tell that might indicate when the younger man would make his move. The gang leader's breathing was ragged and uneven, his chest rising and falling in the irregular rhythm of barely controlled panic. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool evening air, and his gun hand shook slightly as adrenaline flooded his system. Everything about his posture screamed amateur, a man who had relied on intimidation and superior numbers rather than actual skill. In contrast, Ezekiel was as calm as a mountain lake on a windless day. His breathing was slow and controlled, his stance balanced and relaxed. The hand holding his pistol was steady as granite, and his eyes held the cold certainty of a man who knew exactly how this confrontation would end. "You are afraid," Crane said, trying to regain some psychological advantage. "That is why you are stalling. You know I am faster than you." Ezekiel almost smiled. "Speed is not everything in a gunfight, son. Accuracy matters more than quickness, and experience matters most of all." The old marshal's voice took on an almost instructional tone, as if he were teaching a lesson to a student. "In 43 gunfights, I have never drawn first. I wait for my opponent to make his move, then I respond. It gives me a fraction of a second to see where he is aiming and adjust accordingly." "You are lying," Crane insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "Nobody could be that good. Ask the 43 dead men if you can find them," Ezekiel replied calmly. "Oh wait, you cannot, because they are all on the ground." Crane's control finally snapped. With a scream of rage, he brought his pistol up in a fast draw that would have impressed most observers. His movement was smooth and practiced, the result of years of gunfighting experience. The weapon cleared leather and swung toward his target in one fluid motion. But Ezekiel Thorne was no ordinary opponent. The old marshal's draw was not fast in the conventional sense. It was not the lightning-quick snap of a young gunfighter showing off his speed. Instead, it was something else entirely. Economical, precise, perfect. His hand moved to his weapon, gripped it, and brought it up in one seamless motion that seemed to flow like water. Both guns fired simultaneously, the twin explosions echoing off the brick walls like thunder. But only one shot found its mark. Crane staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. He looked down at the spreading red stain across his chest, then back up at Ezekiel with the expression of a man who had just seen something impossible. "How?" he whispered, blood beginning to foam at the corners of his mouth. Ezekiel's smoking pistol was already back in its holster. 40 years of practice, he said simply, "and you telegraphed your shot by tensing your shoulder a half-second before you drew." Crane tried to raise his weapon for another shot, but his strength was already fading. The pistol slipped from his nerveless fingers and clattered to the ground. He took another step backward and collapsed against the brick wall, leaving a bloody smear as he slid down to sit in the dirt. "Crane Murdoch, real name Carter Murphy," Ezekiel said, standing over the dying man. "Wanted for murder in 4 territories. The federal bounty on your head is $500, dead or alive." The gang leader tried to speak, but only blood came from his mouth. His eyes were already glazing over as his life drained away into the dirt of the alley. Within moments, he was still. Ezekiel stood quietly for a moment, looking down at the body. Then he reached into his vest and withdrew his leather journal, adding another name and date to the long list written there. "Number 44, he said to himself. "Carter Murphy, also known as Crane Murdoch. October 23, 1897. Perdition Creek, Nevada Territory." The sound of running footsteps echoed through the alley as Sheriff William Donovan arrived with 2 deputies in tow. They had heard the gunshots from the jail and come running, but they stopped short when they saw the carnage spread across the confined space. "Sweet Jesus," Donovan breathed, taking in the scene. Wade Morrison unconscious against the wall, Briggs sprawled senseless on the ground, Jack Morrison cowering in the corner, and Crane Murdoch very obviously dead. What in the hell happened here? Sarah McNeil stepped forward from her hiding place, her voice shaking but clear. "These men cornered me and this gentleman," she said, pointing to Ezekiel. "They were going to hurt me, and they threatened to rob Papa's bank. But he saved me." Sheriff Donovan looked more closely at the old man, noticing the badge pinned to his vest for the first time. "You are a federal marshal?" Ezekiel carefully unpinned the star and slipped it into his coat pocket. "Retired," he said simply. "But some things a man cannot ignore." The sheriff looked around the alley again, noting the precision with which the surviving gang members had been disabled rather than killed. "Professional work," he observed. "Very professional." More townspeople began arriving, drawn by the sound of gunfire and the commotion. Word spread quickly through the small community that the notorious Crane Murdoch gang had been stopped by the quiet old man who lived in the cabin outside town. James McNeil, Sarah's father and the head teller at Cattleman's Bank, pushed through the crowd and gathered his daughter in his arms. When he learned what Ezekiel had done, tears of gratitude streamed down his face. "You saved my little girl," he said, gripping the old marshal's hand. "How can I ever repay you?" "Just take better care of her," Ezekiel replied quietly, "and perhaps consider hiring some security for your bank. Men like these always work in groups, and they share information about vulnerable targets." The sheriff was already organizing the cleanup, directing his deputies to collect the surviving gang members and prepare the body for the undertaker. Jack Morrison was sobbing with relief at still being alive, while Wade Morrison was beginning to regain consciousness with a severe headache and no memory of how he had ended up on the ground. As the crowd grew larger, Ezekiel found himself the center of unwanted attention. People whispered and pointed, their faces showing a mixture of awe, gratitude, and not a little fear. Word was already spreading about who he really was and what he had done during his years as a federal marshal. The old man stepped back into the shadows, uncomfortable with the scrutiny. He had come to Perdition Creek seeking anonymity and peace, not to relive his violent past in front of an audience. Sarah McNeil approached him one more time before her father led her away. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Ezekiel touched the brim of his hat. "Just remember what you saw here tonight, miss. Remember that sometimes good men have to do terrible things to protect innocent people. And remember that justice always has a price." As the crowd began to disperse and the sheriff finished his work, Ezekiel walked slowly toward the alley entrance. His part in this drama was over, but he knew that word would spread beyond Perdition Creek. By tomorrow, every outlaw in 3 territories would know that the legendary Grayback Marshal was still alive and still dangerous. He paused at the mouth of the alley and looked back one more time at the scene of violence. 44 men now lay dead by his hand, and he could remember every face, every name, every moment when he had been forced to take a life in the service of justice. The weight of those deaths pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden as he walked home through the empty streets. He had hoped his killing days were over, but apparently the world had other plans for Ezekiel Thorne. Some burdens, he reflected as he disappeared into the darkness, a man carries until the day he dies. And some men are born to carry them. 3 weeks after the confrontation in the alley, Sarah McNeil made her way through the morning mist to the small cabin that sat on a rise overlooking Perdition Creek. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, and her breath formed small clouds as she walked along the dirt path that led to Ezekiel Thorne's front door. In her hands, she carried a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked from the meadow near town. They were simple blooms, nothing fancy or expensive, but they were all she could afford on her wages from the bank. More importantly, they came from her heart. She found the old marshal sitting on his front porch, a cup of coffee steaming in his weathered hands as he watched the sun rise over the distant mountains. He wore no gun belt this morning, and his federal badge was nowhere to be seen. Instead, he looked like what he had tried so hard to become, just another retired old man seeking peace in his final years. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne," Sarah said quietly, not wanting to startle him. Ezekiel looked up from his coffee and nodded. "Morning, Miss McNeil. You are up early." She held out the flowers with a shy smile. "I wanted to bring you these, and to thank you again for what you did. Papa says I should not bother you, but I could not stop thinking about that night." The old marshal accepted the flowers with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the violence he had displayed in the alley. "They are beautiful, Sarah. Thank you." He gestured to the empty chair beside him on the porch. "Would you like to sit for a moment? I do not get much company these days." Sarah settled into the chair and looked out over the peaceful valley below them. It was hard to believe that just a few weeks ago, this same man had been locked in mortal combat with 5 dangerous outlaws. This morning he seemed more like a kindly grandfather than a legendary killer. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. "What you had to do that night?" Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment, sipping his coffee and considering his answer. "Every life I have taken weighs on my soul," he said finally. "Even men like Crane Murdoch who deserve to die. Taking a human life changes something inside you, and it never changes back." "But you saved me," Sarah insisted. And you saved the town from those terrible men. Yes, he agreed. And that is what I tell myself when I cannot sleep at night. That sometimes good men must do evil things to protect innocent people. But knowing something is necessary does not make it easy to live with. A week later, the town council of Perdition Creek held an emergency meeting in the back room of Henderson's General Store. Mayor Francis Caldwell, a portly man in his 50s, had called the gathering to discuss a pressing matter that had been weighing on everyone's mind since the night Ezekiel Thorne had saved Sarah McNeil. "Gentlemen," Caldwell began, looking around the table at the assembled business leaders and prominent citizens. "We all know why we are here. The events of 3 weeks ago have made it clear that our current sheriff, while a good man, is not equipped to handle the kind of dangerous criminals that seem to be drawn to our community." James McNeil, still grateful for his daughter's rescue, nodded vigorously. "Ezekiel Thorne proved that night that he is exactly the kind of lawman we need. The man handled 5 armed outlaws by himself and did it without getting anyone innocent killed." Doc Harrison, the town physician who had treated the surviving gang members, stroked his gray beard thoughtfully. The precision of his work was remarkable. He could have killed all of them, but he chose to disable rather than destroy. That shows both skill and restraint. "But is he willing to take the job?" asked Thomas Wright, who owned the largest ranch in the area. "The man came here seeking retirement, not a return to violence." "Only one way to find out," Mayor Caldwell replied. "We send a delegation to make him a formal offer." 2 days later, Caldwell and McNeil rode out to Ezekiel's cabin with an official proposal. They found him in his small garden, tending to the last of his autumn vegetables before the first hard frost arrived. "Mr. Thorne," Caldwell began formally, "the town council has voted unanimously to offer you the position of sheriff of Perdition Creek, with a salary of $100 per month plus a housing allowance." Ezekiel straightened slowly, his pale eyes meeting those of both men. "That is generous, Mayor, but I must decline. I hung up my badge 10 years ago for good reasons." McNeil stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my daughter's life. The least I can do is ask you to consider protecting the whole community the same way." "I am honored by your confidence," Ezekiel replied. "But I came here to find peace, not to pin a target on my chest again. Wearing a badge makes a man a magnet for every young gun who wants to make a reputation." The 2 men left disappointed but not surprised. They had expected the refusal, but they had felt obligated to make the offer anyway. That evening, Ezekiel sat alone in his small cabin, reading by lamplight. The book was a collection of poetry by Walt Whitman, far removed from the violence and death that had defined so much of his life. But his concentration kept wandering to thoughts of the conversation with the mayor and the banker. He rose from his chair and walked to an old wooden chest in the corner of the room. Inside, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, was his marshal's badge and gun belt. He had not touched either since the night in the alley, but now he lifted them out and held them in the lamplight. The badge was tarnished with age, its brass surface marked by dents and scratches that told stories of violence survived and justice delivered. The gun belt was worn smooth from years of use, the leather soft and supple from careful maintenance. These items had been his constant companions for 20 years, through good times and terrible ones. After a long moment, he rewrapped them and placed them back in the chest. Some chapters of a man's life, he told himself, were meant to stay closed. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. 5 years passed in relative peace. Ezekiel tended his garden, read his books, and slowly began to find the tranquility he had sought. The town prospered under Sheriff Donovan's leadership, and the events of that violent night began to fade into local legend. Sarah McNeil grew into a confident young woman who spoke often of pursuing a career in law enforcement, inspired by the man who had saved her life. She had taken to visiting Ezekiel's cabin regularly, bringing him news from town and listening to his stories of the frontier days. On a crisp morning in October, exactly 5 years after the alley confrontation, Sarah arrived at the cabin with excitement written across her face. She carried a letter in her hands and could barely contain her enthusiasm. "Mr. Thorne," she announced breathlessly, "I have wonderful news. The territorial governor has approved my application to attend the police academy in Carson City. I am going to become a deputy marshal, just like you were." Ezekiel looked up from the fence he was mending, a mixture of pride and concern crossing his weathered features. That is a dangerous path, Sarah. Are you certain it is what you want? More certain than I have ever been about anything, she replied firmly. You showed me that night that sometimes one person can make a difference, that sometimes someone has to stand between innocent people and those who would hurt them. The old marshal set down his tools and walked over to where she stood. Law enforcement is not a romantic adventure, he said gently. It is hard, dangerous work that will change you in ways you cannot imagine. I know, Sarah said quietly, but it is work that needs doing. And you taught me that good people cannot simply stand by and hope someone else will act. Ezekiel studied her face for a long moment, seeing in her young features the same determination that had driven him to pin on a badge all those years ago. Finally, he nodded slowly. If this is truly your calling, then you have my blessing. But promise me something. Anything. Promise me you will remember that the badge is a tool for protecting others, not for advancing yourself. And promise me you will never forget the weight of the responsibility you are accepting. I promise, Sarah said solemnly. 2 weeks later, Ezekiel made a journey he had avoided for 5 years. He rode slowly through the cemetery on the hill overlooking Perdition Creek, stopping at a simple granite headstone that bore the name Carter Murphy, also known as Crane Murdoch. The grave was well maintained despite the fact that no one in town had known the dead man's real identity. Someone, probably Sheriff Donovan, had seen to it that even outlaws received a decent burial. Ezekiel dismounted and stood quietly beside the grave, his hat in his hands. I have been thinking about you, Carter, he said softly to the headstone. About the choices that brought you to that alley and the choices that brought me there to meet you. The wind rustled through the dry grass, but otherwise the cemetery was silent. You were not born evil, I expect. Something made you into what you became, just as something made me into what I became. The difference is that I chose to use violence to protect people, while you chose to use it to hurt them. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small object, something he had carved from a piece of oak during the long winter evenings. It was a simple wooden cross, nothing elaborate or expensive, but it was made with care and respect. I do not forgive what you did to innocent people, he continued as he placed the cross at the head of the grave. But I understand that we were both products of a violent time and a hard country. Perhaps in another world, we might have been friends instead of enemies. A year later, Sarah McNeil graduated from the Territorial Police Academy with the highest marks in her class. She returned to Perdition Creek wearing a deputy's badge and carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her calling. Ezekiel was waiting for her at the train station, his own badge pinned to his vest for the first time in 6 years. When Sarah saw it, her eyes widened with surprise and delight. You changed your mind about wearing it again, she observed. Not about wearing it, he corrected with a small smile. About why I wear it. For 20 years, I wore this badge because it was my job. Now I wear it because it connects me to people like you who have chosen to carry on the work. Sheriff Donovan had passed away during the winter, and the town council had once again approached Ezekiel about taking the position. This time, with Sarah as his deputy, he had accepted, but their partnership would be brief and largely ceremonial. Ezekiel was nearing 80 now, and his body was finally beginning to show the accumulated wear of a hard life. He served as sheriff for just over a year before retiring permanently and recommending Sarah as his replacement. The day she pinned on the sheriff's badge, Sarah visited Ezekiel's cabin one final time as his deputy. They sat together on his porch, watching the sun set over the peaceful valley below. I am afraid, she admitted quietly. Afraid I will not be strong enough when the time comes. Afraid I will make the wrong choice and someone will die because of it. Ezekiel reached over and patted her hand gently. Fear is not weakness, Sarah. It is wisdom. The day you stop being afraid of making mistakes is the day you become dangerous to the people you have sworn to protect. He pointed to his marshal's badge, which lay on the small table between them. I am giving this to you, not to wear, but to remember. Remember that justice is not about revenge or personal satisfaction. It is about standing between innocent people and those who would harm them, regardless of the cost to yourself. Sarah accepted the badge with reverence, understanding the weight of what she was receiving. This was not just a piece of metal, but a symbol of everything Ezekiel Thorne had stood for during his long career. 20 years later, an elderly Sarah McNeil, now Sheriff Sarah McNeil Harrison, stood in the cemetery on the hill overlooking Perdition Creek. She was no longer young, her golden hair now streaked with silver and her face lined by years of responsibility and hard decisions. Before her stood a new granite headstone that read simply, Ezekiel Thorne, United States Marshal, 1820 to 1918. He stood between evil and innocence. In her weathered hands, she held the marshal's badge he had given her so many years before, its brass surface now polished to a warm glow by decades of careful attention. "Thank you," she said quietly to the stone, "for showing me what it means to serve others, for teaching me that justice is not about being the fastest or the strongest, but about being willing to sacrifice for those who cannot protect themselves." A young woman approached from behind, wearing a deputy's badge and moving with the confident stride of someone comfortable with authority. She was Sarah's niece, Emma McNeil, who had just graduated from the police academy and would soon take over as sheriff when Sarah retired. "Ready to go, Aunt Sarah?" Emma asked gently. "In a moment," Sarah replied. "I was just telling Mr. Thorne about your graduation." Emma looked down at the grave with respect. "I wish I could have met him. From everything you have told me, he must have been an extraordinary man." He was, Sarah agreed. But more than that, he understood something that too many lawmen forget. He understood that wearing a badge is not about power or authority. It is about service and sacrifice. The two women walked slowly back toward town as the sun set behind them, casting long shadows across the peaceful cemetery. In the distance, the lights of Perdition Creek were beginning to twinkle to life, a testament to the generations of men and women who had chosen to stand guard against the darkness. The legacy of Ezekiel Thorne lived on in the quiet streets of the town he had protected, in the badge that passed from one generation of lawmen to the next, and in the simple truth that sometimes one person can make all the difference in the world. If you enjoyed this tale of justice and the price of protecting others, please like this video and subscribe for more stories of courage in the Old West. We bring you tales of honor, sacrifice, and the quiet heroes who shaped our nation every week. Until next time, may justice guide your path, and may you always remember that true strength lies not in violence, but in the willingness to stand for what is right.